The night Margaret Holloway's car went off Route 9 and into the ditch below the old Miller Bridge, there were exactly 3 people who could have seen it happen. 2 of them drove past without stopping. The roads were icy, and it was late, and they told themselves someone else would call it in. The third person who saw it was the one person in the entire town of Clover Creek, Tennessee, who Margaret had publicly, loudly, and repeatedly said she never wanted to see again as long as she lived. His name was James Callum, and without thinking about any of that, without calculating what it would cost him, or what she would say later, or what any of it meant, he pulled over, got out of his truck in the freezing rain, climbed down that embankment in the dark, and pulled her out of that car before it filled with water. She was unconscious when he got to her. She did not know it was him. Not until she woke up in the hospital 3 hours later and the nurse told her who had carried her up that hillside and driven her to the emergency room and sat in the waiting room for 2 hours before quietly leaving, without telling anyone his name. The look on Margaret's face in that moment, according to the nurse who was there, was something she had never seen before and never forgot. It was not gratitude, not right away. It was something more complicated than that. Something that looked like a woman watching everything she thought. She knew about a person crack straight down the middle and fall apart at her feet. This is Evergleam Stories, and what I am about to tell you is the story of James Callum and Margaret Holloway. A story about hatred and what lives underneath it. About what it takes to see a person clearly when you have spent years making sure you could not. And about the one moment that changed a town's opinion of a man who had stopped caring what the town thought a long time ago. Stay with me, because this one does not go where you think it is going. Before we begin, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the bell, because you do not want to miss what is coming. Clover Creek was the kind of small town where everyone knew everything about everyone, and most of what they knew they had decided years ago and had no intention of revisiting. Population 4,000. One main street, 2 churches, a diner called Patsy's that had not changed its menu in 30 years and did not intend to. James Callum had grown up there. He was the son of Roy Callum, who had been the kind of man that small towns remember for the wrong reasons. Roy drank. Roy borrowed money and did not pay it back. Roy got into 2 separate disputes with neighboring farmers over property lines that dragged on for years and cost everyone involved more than the land was worth. By the time Roy died, he had managed to offend or cheat or simply exhaust almost every family in a 20-mile radius. And James was Roy's son. That was the thing about Clover Creek. It had a long memory, and it did not make many distinctions between a man and the man he came from. James had spent his whole childhood watching people's eyes change when they heard his last name. Teachers who expected less from him. Neighbors who watched him with a particular kind of suspicion. Shop owners who kept an eye on him when he came in, even when he was 8 years old and had done nothing wrong. He had tried for a while. He had been a good student. He had worked summers on the Delaney farm from the time he was 14, and Earl, Delaney had said more than once that James was the best worker he had ever had. He had stayed out of trouble in a town that was always vaguely expecting him to cause some. But there is only so many years a person can try to prove something to people who have already made up their minds. And at some point, James Callum stopped trying. He kept to himself. He ran a small auto repair shop on the edge of town that did good work at fair prices. He did not go to town events. He did not socialize. He nodded when people nodded at him, and did not push for more than that. He became, in the way that misunderstood people sometimes become, exactly what everyone had decided he was: distant, cold. The kind of man you crossed the street to avoid, not because he had ever done anything, but because he felt like someone who might. Margaret Holloway was different. Margaret had a reason. She was 34 years old, and she had lived in Clover Creek her whole life, except for 4 years at college. And she had come back because her mother needed her, and because she loved the town even with all its smallness and stubbornness and long memory. She taught 3rd grade at the elementary school, and she was the kind of teacher that children remembered for the rest of their lives. Warm and funny and fiercely protective of the kids in her classroom, especially the quiet ones, especially the ones who came from difficult homes. Her younger brother was named Patrick. He was 28, and he was the kind of young man who made everyone around him feel like the sun was out even when it was not. Easy smile, big laugh. The kind of person who remembered your birthday and showed up to help you move furniture without being asked. 2 years ago, Patrick had been driving home from a friend's house on a Saturday night when another car ran a stop sign on Birch Road and hit him on the driver's side going 40 miles an hour. Patrick spent 6 weeks in the hospital. He had 2 surgeries. He had physical therapy for almost a year. He walked with a slight limp now that the doctors said might be permanent. The car that ran the stop sign belonged to James Callum. James had not been drinking. That was established clearly by the police report. He had not been on his phone. The stop sign at that particular intersection had always been partially obscured by an overgrown oak tree that the county had been meaning to trim for 2 years. Multiple people had filed complaints about it. Nothing had been done. None of that mattered to Margaret. Her brother had spent 6 weeks unable to walk. She had sat in hospital waiting rooms and held her mother's hand through 2 surgeries and watched Patrick learn to walk again with a physical therapist in a white room that smelled like antiseptic. She had watched him try to hide how much it hurt. She had watched her mother age 10 years in 6 weeks. James had come to the hospital the day after the accident. He had brought nothing. He had not known what to bring. He had stood in the hallway outside Patrick's room and asked the nurse if the family was available to speak with him, and the nurse had gone inside and come back and said that the family was not available. He had tried once more, a week later, and this time Margaret had come to the hallway herself. She had looked at him, and she had said, in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled, that she needed him to stop coming here, and that she needed him to understand that there was nothing he could say, and that the best thing he could do for her family was to stay away from them permanently. He had nodded. He had left. He had not come back. The town took Margaret's side. Of course they did. They had been looking for a reason for a long time, and now they had one that felt righteous. James Callum had hurt a good family. It did not matter that the accident report was complicated. It did not matter that the county had ignored a dangerous intersection for 2 years. It mattered that Patrick Holloway walked with a limp now, and James Callum was the reason. He became, in the official opinion of Clover Creek, the most hated man in town. He did not fight it. He went to work. He came home. He kept his head down. There were months when his shop lost customers he could not afford to lose, and he took on extra work on the weekends just to keep the lights on. There were evenings when he sat on his porch alone and thought about leaving, and then did not leave because the shop was paid for, and he had nowhere particular to go. and because some part of him felt, in a way he could not have clearly explained, that leaving would mean they had been right about him all along. He stayed, and the town kept its distance, and 2 years passed. The night of the accident on Route 9. It was February, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in 4 hours, and the roads had iced over faster than anyone expected. Margaret had been coming back from her mother's house, outside of town. She had stayed too late, and she had known the roads were getting bad, and she had told herself it was only 12 miles, and she knew this road. She did not see the patch of black ice until she was already on it. The car went sideways, and then went off the shoulder and down the embankment and into the ditch below the Miller Bridge, and the front end hit the shallow water, and the car tilted forward, and the cold came in immediately through the cracked windshield. James had been driving back from a parts pickup in the next town over. He saw the skid marks on the shoulder. He saw the gap in the guardrail. He pulled over without deciding to. The water was maybe 2 feet deep, but it was February, and it was rising, and the car was tilted at an angle that was going to be a problem. He went down the embankment on his hands and knees in the dark. He got to the car, and the door was jammed, and he broke the window with his elbow, and the cold water hit him immediately, and he did not think about that. He got her out. He did not know who she was until he had her up the bank and in the beam of his headlights and saw her face. He recognized her immediately. He knew exactly who she was. He put her in the back seat of his truck and turned the heat all the way up and drove to the hospital without stopping once. He carried her into the emergency room. He told them she had been in a car accident on Route 9 and gave them the location so someone could go down for the car. And then he sat in the waiting room in wet clothes in February until someone came out and told him she was stable and she was going to be fine. And then he stood up and walked out to the parking lot and drove home. He did not leave his name. Margaret found out in the morning. The nurse described him. Margaret knew immediately. She lay in that hospital bed for a long time after the nurse left the room, and she stared at the ceiling, and she did not say anything. Her mother came. Patrick came, limping down the hospital corridor with his familiar, uneven walk, and he hugged her for a long time, and then sat beside her bed, and they talked. At some point, she told them who had pulled her out of the car. Patrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know." She looked at him. She said, "What do you mean you know?" He said, "I have known for a while that the accident was not entirely his fault. I looked into it. I talked to the county engineer 6 months ago about that intersection. They finally trimmed that tree last fall. Did you notice?" She had not noticed. Patrick said, "I am not saying it was not hard. I'm not saying it did not change things for me. I'm saying that I have been angry at the wrong size of thing for 2 years, and I think you might have been too." She went to the shop 3 days after she was discharged from the hospital. It was a Thursday afternoon, and the shop was quiet. James was underneath a truck when she came in, and he heard the door and came out and stood up and saw her and went completely still. She stood in the middle of that garage and she looked at him for a long moment. And then she said, "I owe you something." He said, "You do not owe me anything." She said, "I owe you an apology. I have owed you one for a long time. And I owe you a thank you. And I am here to give you both of them, whether you want them or not." He stood there with grease on his hands and did not say anything. She said, "I spent 2 years making sure everyone in this town knew exactly what I thought of you. And I was not entirely wrong about the accident. But I was wrong about you, and I think somewhere underneath all of it I've always known that. And it was easier to be angry than to know that. He said, "Your brother almost died." She said, "I know. And you came to the hospital, and I sent you away." There was a long silence between them. Not uncomfortable, just full. He said, "How is your arm?" She had a hairline fracture in her left wrist from the crash. She said, "It is fine. It is nothing." He nodded. She said, "I want to start over. I do not know if that is something you want. But I want to say it." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "There is a coffee place on Main that is not terrible, if you are not in a hurry." She was not in a hurry. On a Thursday afternoon in February, and half the town saw them through the window, and by Friday morning everyone in Clover Creek knew. And opinions, the way opinions sometimes do when something real cuts through them, began very slowly to shift. It did not happen overnight. These things never do. But Patrick Holloway started bringing his truck to James Callum's shop. And Margaret started saying different things when his name came up. And gradually, the story that the town had been telling about James Callum for 30 years began to develop a crack. And then another. And then another. The thing about hatred is that it needs a simple story to survive. It needs one version of a person, fixed and unchanging. And it needs everyone around it to agree not to look too closely. James Callum was never the man Clover Creek decided he was. He was just a man who had been seen through his father's eyes for so long that eventually he had stopped trying to show anyone his own. And it took one night on an icy road and one woman willing to walk into a garage and say, "I was wrong," to give him back the thing that had been taken from him before he was old enough to protect it. His name. Just his name. On its own terms. With nothing attached to it but who he actually was. And that turned out